Hi everyone, my name is Jason Sangorn and I'm the VP of Pre-Sales here at Akili. Today I want to walk you through our Spark FP&A Accelerator. As part of our FP&A Accelerator, it is a representation of that end-to-end planning process. So as part of that planning process, really organized it across these three different pillars as we think about the completion of that type of process. The first one we'll look at is how do organizations align? How do we minimize the cycle time that goes on between plans and forecast? To facilitate that, we'll review a couple different roles, first from a leadership perspective. So as we think about understanding performance, leveraging a scorecard, then using that information to shape that corporate strategy into something that aligns to where we think the company is going from a forward-looking perspective. So we'll look again at different scorecards, different methodologies that leaderships can use to really start to shape that strategy, maybe via a tops-down target, really give some of the operational teams some of the different guardrails as they go into their planning process. The other side we'll look at is then from an operational perspective. So as we think about now building up those bottoms up components, analyzing maybe different trends as we think about different operating expenses and maybe exploring different methodologies on how we can approach each one of those different areas. Additionally to that, also look at the flexibility when we think about revenue planning, different ways that we can accommodate those different revenue components as they all come together to really produce that P&L. The other area we'll look at is explore a little bit more about Anaplan's data agnostic capability and how that's a benefit. So as we think about loading all types of data, both financial, non-financial, all of that coming together in a system that we can plan and use and report upon as part of our process. Now, one of the things we'll look at as we think about reporting on that data is variance analysis. This area is crucial to businesses. Really understand what has happened, how we've trended against our budget or our forecast, but maybe take that next step and also start to shape what that roadmap may look like prior to updating our forecast or plan. The last section in red that we'll be looking at really exemplifies the power of Anaplan as we think about some of the what ifs, some of the driver sensitivity, the different components where we have different areas of looking at what is the impact if we change this driver and such. So we'll look at different methodologies of how organizations take a stab at that within Anaplan, really getting the most value out of answering those different what ifs that we know are very prevalent today. The other last piece we'll look at is reporting. So what are those different options as we go through our process of reporting those integrated financials that we're building up as part of that plan or forecast? But additionally, how do we create some of those pixel perfect type reports, either from a quarterly perspective or a monthly perspective, as we look at that and provide that to management? So lots of different areas that we'll go through as part of today's solution. And let's jump right in. To facilitate the user experience as we think about different types of users using Anaplan, different methodologies or different dashboards that they can leverage within that process. In this case, from a corporate perspective or a leadership perspective, different KPIs, metrics that we can pull in across headcount planning, P&L focused, balance sheet, cash flow, different KPIs, metrics that we can pull across the organization and present that as part of that user experience. In addition to that, different grids of data that we can interact with and view from maybe a quarter over quarter perspective. And as I'm clicking through, we can also see some of the visualizations come to life and synchronize to different areas that I'm looking at. And these visualizations, they're integrated again in the platform. So not only can I interact with them, but also, again, as I click through different forms of information, we're updating, visualizing that different information. So lots of different areas that we'll look at as we think about charting within Anaplan. As part of Anaplan's user experience, the other thing to note is it's multidimensional, right? So as we think about navigating through different parts of the organization, we're able to experience this in real time. So no longer the need for click and refresh, for waiting for that report to run as part of your process. We can very quickly navigate through different parts of the organization, different time periods, different versions that we'll look at later to really drive that user experience. Now, as we're going through each one of these different pages, one thing to note is Anaplan's flexibility, really its configurability to your organization. And what do I mean by that? Well, as part of that user experience, very easy to make different updates that maybe align to specific things or experiences that you're trying to drive as part of that process. So if maybe the team is more visual and we want that front and center, we can drag and drop that information. We can pull from different areas here where we're looking to add maybe more metrics, charts, images as part of information that we are focused on or maybe going towards as we think about focusing on different areas, right? So as I think about adding maybe an additional KPI, there's no coding that's necessary as part of that. We can see it's point and click. And maybe I'm looking to pull across different metrics, maybe adding EBITDA as a percent. I can very quickly update this dashboard, this page for my users now to experience. Now, as part of our offering as well, one of the things we want to look at as we stay in that role-based dashboard for a corporate or leadership perspective, maybe the inclusion of different initiatives that we're looking to implement within the plan or forecast. In this case, what we started to build is that base case and start to include and identify those different initiatives. So down below, we've included different areas where on demand, as needed, we can certainly add different initiatives that we want to capture in both the narrative or the qualitative data, or we can also start to add the financial impact to each one of these different initiatives. And what do I mean? So as each of these different initiatives, we can certainly identify and target the different parts of the P&L, could be different parts of the balance sheet or cash flow that we think is going to be impacted as we think about executing upon these different initiatives. And where the real-time capability comes into play again, as we look at it, is as we start to understand whether we include or exclude different initiatives, we're able to isolate each one of those individually or collectively see what that impact could be to our plan. Now, as part of the different initiatives, we also may want to start providing guardrails for our operational teams prior to them going into their plan or forecast. To facilitate that, we have a tops-down revenue target that we can use and really start to shape, again, that strategy for revenue. In this case, we've brought in our organizational hierarchy to help drive that from our different geos down to our different territories or regions, maybe down to different segments or channels. Lots of flexibility there as we think about performing this tops-down input. So as I change potentially the US, I can input potentially different growth percentages, maybe dictate a specific amount. But as I'm growing this part of the US, our final target is updating for the US, but that's also in real time getting cascaded down to our territories and then down to our channels and segments as well. So again, an example of that real-time capability where we can get insight into that impact going all the way down to those operational teams. Now, as part of that tops-down plan, we can also start to refine each one of those areas. So, for instance, as I look at the different territories within the US, I can choose to hold or maybe override each one of those different areas while still maintaining what that tops down target is. So as we think about also the collaboration that we'll get into later, this could also be an area where we're working with leadership across regional managers, different product owners, different segment owners to refine what that plan or budget may look like. Additionally, as part of that, we're also able to do that from an operating expense perspective. So as the departments, the cost center owners go in and start to update their plan, they have that flexibility across those different operating expense items and start to allocate maybe a target for each one of those different areas. In this case, we have additional methodologies that we can also start to apply from an allocation perspective, where I can choose to use maybe that prior year spend, or maybe it's driven off FTE as part of that. So different areas and different ways that we can spread and allocate those down to the departments. As part of that, we also still have that flexibility where I can choose to hold or override certain departments as I think about assigning a specific target potentially to certain departments. Now, we've been focused here on building up that in-year forecast or budget, but also Anaplan has that capability to plan across different years. So as we think about that strategic plan, that long-range plan coming together, this is an example from an operating expense. So as we build up potentially our revenue target, we can choose to maybe drive that off of a historical percent of revenue, or we can drive that off maybe a specific annual increase or decrease number that we'd want to apply. So in this case, rather than just focusing only on that in-year, now we can plan across multiple years. So I can enter in potentially a 10% growth for G&A, and I can actually copy and paste those values now across time. So lots of flexibility as we think about planning, not only just the in-year, but also from a long-range perspective, whether it be 3, 5, 50 years into the future. Now, as part of our revenue target and as we're starting to build up what that number may look like, what we may want to do as part of that is validate that we can actually execute upon that target from an operational perspective. Now, to facilitate that particular piece, we are going to have to pull different parts of the organization to really get a good feel for if we're able to execute upon that plan or target. In this case, we're looking at it from a sales capacity perspective. So as we're developing that target, can we actually have the sales team there that can sell and execute upon that particular target? In this case, what we've done is we've brought in sales information, so looking at maybe their projected capacity. We also brought in HR information, so as we think about including variables like attrition, maybe loss of sales, or the cost of hiring. Also factoring in phasing. So as we bring those new folks in, what's that ramp look like so that we can achieve or attain that target? So as we're bringing in this information, this will again help identify where that potential gap between our projected capacity is and our target that we've created as part of that revenue tops down strategy. Now, a couple different levers we can start to look at as part of addressing that gap. We could potentially increase our productivity from an adjustment perspective. Say if we think our reps will be maybe 15% more productive. So different ways we're starting to minimize that gap. Ultimately, we may need to hire additional folks to satisfy and to achieve or attain that target. So maybe there's 2 additional folks per role that we need. So as we go through that input process, starting to model those components out, we can see in real time again how we're able to address or attain that target via, in this case, additional folks that we would bring in. So now that we have looked at that tops down or really that management or leadership point of view, what we can also start to look at now is that operational view. So from that departmental or cost center owner, what does their interaction look like? To drive that process, we've identified kind of different areas that they'll be planning to as part of the overall forecast or planning process. Best way to think of these different areas and their interaction or user experience is it's really a template-sized view. So as I have access to specific cost centers, I'll be planning, budgeting to each one of those different components that we see here on the left-hand side. So as a cost center owner or department owner, I can start that process of making the respective updates to my forecast or my bottoms up piece. And as part of that exercise we did earlier, we have visibility into that target versus our bottoms up to expose what that variance may be as we begin that build up of the bottoms up portion. Now, here's that example again, as we think about the alignment and driving towards that corporate strategy that we identified. This is an area where we're providing that transparency to our operational teams, those guardrails, so there's no ambiguity as we think about making updates, really what we should be aligning to from an operational perspective. Now, before we jump into planning each one of those different components, one of the things we may start to look at is the different data components first that really help bring each of these different areas to life. From a data perspective, Anaplan is data agnostic. And what does that mean? It means we can bring in all sorts of data, both financial, non-financial, benchmark data, into the platform. So we can see here on the left-hand side different examples of on-prem, cloud, a data warehouse, HR, CRM type data that we can bring into the platform. Different methodologies that we can bring, whether certain areas lend themselves to a CSV or a flat file upload. We also have customers using the out-of-the-box Java-based client called Anaplan Connect to extract and pull that data, or different partnerships we have with different ETL partners. So Informatica, SnapLogic, Dell Boomi, as an example of different ETLs. We have partnerships that can extract that information into what's called the Data Hub. So now that we're in the Anaplan cloud, the Data Hub is a very important concept as we think about standardizing, really bringing that data, both master data, transactional data, into the Data Hub. The Data Hub allows us, again, to standardize the information. So minimizing, mitigating the multiple ways that folks may be reporting. So common definition for a account hierarchy, common definition for a organizational structure. We're all reporting those same likable numbers as we go through that planning reporting process. The other areas as we think about consuming that data, it could be using the Office suite from a Excel, which is bidirectional, or PowerPoint, or it could be through BI as we think about from a Tableau or Power BI perspective, right? So there's native integrations with each one of those. So as we think about, again, extending the Anaplan platform, different ways that you can certainly go about that. Now, as part of that data being loaded into Anaplan, the first thing we'll look at before our departmental teams go into that plan is variance analysis. So as we think about variance analysis, this is a time when we are starting to look and evaluate our actuals versus maybe our latest forecast or a previous budget. As we look at these different components here, this is where from each of our department owners, we're looking for different explanations for reasons that they may have missed, again, versus their latest forecast. So in this case, as I look at software maintenances, different ways that I can investigate into this information. So I can look within our actuals and very simply right-click, drill down into that information to expose those contributing transactions. Additionally, we can bring in non-ERP data, so maybe information that lives outside your ERP, like vendor spend. So this could be vendor information that includes informations potentially tied to number of licenses, contracts, the terms of each of that information. Really can, again, facilitate, give them that visibility into maybe some of those non-financial, in this case, contract or term type data for our individual vendors. Now, as part of that, we can capture that inline commentary. So if I know these are additional licenses that are driving that particular comment, I can start to populate those respective areas. But really, we can also take that next step and also model around different variances that we've identified. So in this case, what we have is really a representation or visualization of those different categories or variance types that we're seeing from a trend perspective. In this case, I can start to identify for each one of those different variances what that specific spend category may be. So in this case, if we overspent, or in other cases, maybe we underspent, I can start to make those respective tags of each one of these different variances. And what's happening is we're able then to really build that roadmap to updates that we need to make. It's really supporting the changes that I need to make. So as I think about updating my G&A forecast, I really have that support as I think about all the different components that went into it that I've overspent, which could signify I need to take up my budget or forecast as part of the ongoing plan. Now that we have a good grasp of that information, we'll navigate back to our cost center plan and really start to dive into each of these different areas and start to build those up to get a perspective into our P&L. So the first area we may look at is across our headcount planning or workforce planning component. This is where we would marry up that information from your HRIS system and now bring to life that latest roster that you may have for each one of your departments. Again, from a security perspective, you'd only see your respective department. So in this case, different positions, different names, different salary information that you would have access to. And as part of the user experience, this is where we can drive really that analysis as we think about each individual folks' impact from a compensation perspective. Or I can see holistically, what's my department's impact across those different compensation accounts. Now, as part of that validation, maybe first from the existing, I may start to make different changes that I want to certain folks. So for instance, for Donald, looking at a termination date of August, we may want to update that and push that back a bit based on different metrics or factors. So as I make these different types of changes, Anaplan uses what's called effective dating, really to get pinpoint accuracy based on what that impact may be. So as I make that change, you'll notice I'm not hitting submit. I'm not waiting for that number to change as part of that. As quickly as I can make that selection, Anaplan is able to accommodate and help me visualize and see that impact throughout the year. Alternatively, we also have customers that like to plan at a position type. So from a position perspective, we can also plan from that area as well. So rather than focusing on the names, the specific roles on that, the combination of the two, we've really started to now plan at that specific role. So really where these are typically a good fit are those areas where the department's very fluid. The names, the faces are changing quite a bit. Rather than having to update that by person plan, what we can do is specifically target and plan to those specific roles that we need. So in this case, as I look at a product specialist, I'm more focused on the sheer number of folks that I need for that particular role. And as you can see, as I input and make changes to that, our impact down below is updating as part of, again, that real-time nature. Additionally, from an auditability perspective, I have the ability to understand really that data evolution of any of the different values or inputs that I've made in Anaplan. So I can very easily right-click and show history across different spans of time and see all the different changes by user. What was that previous to new value? What specifically did that user change as part of that? All of that is out-of-the-box functionality that Anaplan provides to all users. So not an administrative feature, something that all end users can take a part of. Additionally, different other operating expense methodologies that we can plan to each one of those different components. So for instance, from a T&E perspective, areas we are starting to leverage our different headcount plans, but factor in different drivers that we may set for each one of these different T&E drivers. So for instance, as I'm planning out different assumptions for each one of those different GL accounts, I can very easily influence what that may be. And as I make those adjustments, those changes to my drivers, what's happening in real time as part of that is that my forecast is also changing as part of that different area as well. So this is an area where we can really see, as I make a change to my cost center headcount, going from 18 back to 20 or maybe 19, our numbers, our impact is updating as part of that real-time capability. Now, if I'm trying to better understand why is that particular number 1900 for client dinners, any of these different calculations, formulas, I can very easily right-click and I can drill down or hit F8 to better understand what's happening from a calculation perspective. In this case, Anaplan has also provided the native language that's leveraged as part of that. In this case, an if statement similar to what you find in Excel, but also identifies the different contributing values. In this case, the T&E driver for client dinner, our FTE, to bring to life that 1900 that we're seeing within the impact for T&E. Additionally, as we think about the remainder of the SG&A type of expenses, different methodologies that we can accommodate as part of, again, that plan, that OpEx coming together from a bottoms-up component. In this case, we may want to leverage a direct input where we have our traditional accounts here that we can find in the rows and our different time grains in the columns. Within this, I can certainly start to begin my input process. I can, just like a spreadsheet, copy and paste values across different accounts, different time periods. I can also leverage Anaplan's pivot functionality. So another similarity as we think about planning or that transition from an Excel or spreadsheet to Anaplan, lots of different similarities that kind of help that transition. In this case, a pivot similar to a pivot table. As I think about a multi-department owner, I may not want to plan each department one at a time. To change that view, I can pivot and maybe drag and drop different areas or different formats within this particular worksheet. In this case, maybe I'd like to plan for utilities now across multiple departments. So in this case, when I make changes and maybe again copy and paste as an example, I can now influence multiple departments at once. So as an alternative to planning each one of those accounts for a single cost center or department at a time, I can certainly do that as part of the native functionality and pivot that perspective as part of the user experience. Additionally, what we can see, there's other functions similar to Excel that end users can use, whether it be applying a specific filter, showing or hiding certain rows or columns as part of that. Different ways that users can interact with this type of worksheet. Additionally, we may also want to identify accounts where we think it's appropriate to apply a specific growth percentage, positive or negative. So in this case, we're leveraging the historical information and either growing it again or maybe taking it down by a certain amount. As part of that change, again, we can see that change here in real time. I can influence what that methodology may look like as we think about spreading it now from a monthly perspective. I can also choose to add an incremental amount or override those particular values as well. So lots of flexibility here as we think about how do we apply these different methodologies to each account. We can segment and apply those specific methodologies to different parts of the operating expense budget. The last way we can also start to look at is as we think about capturing information for our different GL accounts, there may be certain accounts where we want to capture information tied to that rather than inputting to a specific account. We want Anaplan to store and maintain and keep those assumptions here within the plan. As part of that, what we're able to do is within any of these different GL accounts we've identified, this is an area where we can on demand, on the fly, without adding or consulting different folks as part of that, we can enable end users to perform an action within Anaplan to do that on demand. So in this case, takes us to a form-based input. If I'm looking to capture more, in this case, items across marketing. So maybe there's a new social media campaign. I can identify that here within Anaplan. I can plan this also for particular vendors, different ways that we can leverage this type of functionality. Now, as I make that selection, Anaplan has now added that sub-GL, or in this case, this marketing detail, and I can begin planning to it immediately. So I can say, maybe that's 1,000 each month, or maybe I can say, hey, from an annual perspective, I know that's 24,000. Different ways that we can plan and accommodate not just at that monthly time frame, but also from an annual amount, or we can even plan at the specific GL. So maybe I understand it's 625,000 for my budget for all of marketing. I can plan and have Anaplan cascade those back down to the specific campaigns or ads or sub-GL line items that I've captured as part of that input process. So lots of flexibility as we think about those coming together. The other component we can start to look at is from a revenue perspective. As we can see here, different methodologies, flexibility that we have to plan for each one of those components. So we could leverage maybe a volume-based or unit-based plan. In this case, what we brought in could be different SKU level or product categories that we'd like to plan to, where we've brought in different pricing assumptions where we can use to either override or grow upon our prior year pricing. Additionally, as part of that, we also bring in our units to really develop and marry up that margin forecast. So as units change, as part of that, we can start to see the impact both from a margin perspective, but also from a scenario perspective. Within this pricing table, we also have that ability to leverage some of those scenarios that we may have from a pricing perspective. In this case, different maybe downside or base or upside, different options that I have here to capture that information, leverage scenarios to have different assumptions for each one of those different drivers. Now, as also part of those pricing assumptions, I can also see the impact to my margin in real time. So as I navigate and select maybe that upside scenario, I can see my margin forecast update and pull in those different variables that we identified for the upside scenario. So this is an example as we think about leveraging some of those what ifs, some of those scenarios that we may have. We can do that within each one of those different disciplines from a planning perspective. Some other methodologies as we look at the buildup of revenue could be from a SaaS perspective or subscription perspective, where we've identified different areas or different offerings that we may have, and planning in this case may be first at a ARPU level for each one of those different offerings. As part of that driver-based piece, we're also identifying different levels or different areas of subscribers. So whether it be adding new subscribers, those we think are available for upsell, churned, different ways we can start to make assumptions by our respective offerings, and then really start to come together from a walk forward perspective over time, what that beginning customer base goes to from our ending customer base based on those different assumptions that we're making. Now, once we've entered in that type of information and inclusive of maybe our sales and marketing spend, we can start to analyze those different SaaS metrics as part of it. So different areas that we see here, both from a revenue perspective, LTV, CAC, all the different metrics, KPIs that we can look at from a SaaS perspective here. Now, again, each one of these are drillable, right? So as I start to want to understand, hey, how is this coming up with this value for May? I can right click, drill down into that information, again, to expose the natural language calculation that Anaplan leverages, but also those contributing values from a subscriber perspective, from an ARPU perspective that we inputted earlier. From a drill down perspective, here's where we can also expose the different breakouts for our subscribers. So as we look at beginning customer base, inclusive of new ads, churn, that information is available for us for further analysis. In addition to this subscriber-based revenue, we can also plan from a cohort perspective. So different cohorts that we've identified, in this case, different ARPU and cost assumptions to really drive what we think that margin would be for our particular cohorts. We can also start to look at all the different SaaS metrics, again, across revenue, CAC, LTV, as part of those different metrics, but also include different metrics later on as part of that process. Now, within this cohort analysis, we can see different metrics, different waterfalls as part of that retention that we can include as part of that overall revenue calculation. Now that we've built up our revenue and operating expense plans, we can also then start to navigate towards performing different sensitivities, what if analysis across those different base forecast pieces that we've started to build up. Now, as part of that process, customers take a couple different approaches as we think about performing that types of sensitivity. So as part of that, what we can certainly do is incorporate that base plan across our P&L, but then side by side, identify different scenarios where we can start to target certain accounts as part of that change. So for instance, if we're trying to understand maybe from a downside perspective, what does a 15% decline in revenue do as part of that? Or conversely, what does a 12% uplift in revenue do from a net income perspective? So we can target again those certain accounts, but then see those impacts side by side to really start to formulate what we should do from a sensitivity perspective. Another way we can approach it is now identifying different drivers within the organization that we want the ability to tweak, to change those assumptions. So what we've done to facilitate that is bring in that base forecast and side by side create a what if or a sandbox type version where we can start to make those changes to individual drivers across the organization. So could be prices that we looked at earlier, salary and benefit drivers, approving certain headcount, or leveraging different scenarios from a pricing perspective. Different drivers, again, that we can surround our what if version and start to quantify what's that impact if we do X. So as part of that, what we can do is execute that latest snapshot from our forecast into our what if version via an action. Think about this as taking all the different components in our forecast and copying them into our what if version. And from here, we can start to make different changes and target different drivers. So for instance, what does a change from 12% to 10% do to retirement? What does changing and updating scenarios from a pricing perspective if we go from upside to downside? So different, again, areas that we can target as part of that what if analysis and make certain changes. And as part of that, what we're able to see side by side is and quantify that variance to our latest forecast or our base forecast that we started with. Additionally, we can perform balance sheet planning from a working capital perspective. In this case, we've identified the working capital drivers from DSO, prepaid expenses, and DPO, where we have the ability now to say, hey, if we're going from 20 days to 25 days in DSO, what's the impact as part of that to my cash, to my current assets as part of that change? What if we change DPO from 40 to 35 days? We can make these types of changes to our working capital drivers and in real time see what that impact is to our balance sheet, but also that's integrated to our cash flow as well. So as we're making those types of changes, we're able to see the impact integrated throughout all those different financial statements. Now that we've started to do and perform some of the sensitivity, we can also take a look at the different reporting options within Anaplan. In this case, we're looking at a consolidated income statement where I can navigate up and down different parts of the hierarchy that I have access to. So if I'm looking at the Southwest or looking at the US holistically, I can navigate to each one of those different areas in real time and see those particular values. Additionally, I can also pivot through different reporting views, whether we're looking at local, management, or consolidated or pre-acquisition acquisition pieces, different components that we can report upon within this type of income statement here. And similar to what we did within our manual input, we can also perform that same type of pivot functionality. So as we're looking and analyzing different parts of our income statement and we want a broader view across our different regions, we can drag and drop that information down to our rows and now get a regional perspective across time for EBITDA, for net income. Those different components now are available to me within this regional type view via a simple pivot within Anaplan. Additionally, we can also start to help customers create the different components of a management report or a quarterly type board book. In this case, we're leveraging Anaplan's management reporting to create slide-specific content that's integrated, that's dynamic. So as I'm navigating and talking through different financial performance for the US, I can make different selections and drill into other areas within the region. So as we think about creating those standardized type formats for our different business units, we can leverage management reporting to drive a lot of the standardized reports, KPIs, areas that we want to report on as part of that quarterly or monthly management type report. This type of information can also be presented upon, right? So as I think about sharing my screen in this information, I can make these meetings more dynamic by drilling and performing reporting any of these different areas, right? So as I think about, here is how EMEA did, I can also say, hey, this is how we did previous quarter. We can navigate through different parts of the P&L, include areas we looked at from a qualitative perspective across initiatives, and then focus again on different KPIs, metrics as part of this. So this is type of information we can present dynamically within meetings, but it can also be exported as part of a PDF solution as well.